I will stand here. Sorry about that. We just learned that we're never going to use that particular room at Davis again. Last year we also had about a 20-minute mess up in there, and I thought it was figured out. We have moved next door. Thanks for being on. I want to introduce our speaker for the FERO series this week. It's Sean Parks from the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, which is a part of the U.S. Forest Service, as you noted earlier today. A lot of people don't know that. Um, Sean comes to us from Missoula, Montana, and he has Davis roots. We actually first met when he was working at the Pacific Southwest Research Station. He did his master's degree here at Davis, and we lived probably, block away from each other, something like that,
Something like
over by
that.
the Birchland School. So I will note before we turn it over to Sean that there are two other FERO lectures this quarter, next quarter. There are two in April. Forgive me, I don't have them on my with me right now. One is going to be Zach Steele. I think it's
The 17th.
17th. Yeah, and then Susan Pritchard will be here on August 24th, both of them in person and also on Zoom. So, Sean, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks you. Hey, everyone online. I'm going to turn off my camera because this angle is not very flattering, and I spilled coffee on my white shirt. So I think that I'll just do that and turn off the camera. Okay. Okay. So how do I get rid of this guy? Anyway, hey, thanks for the invitation, everybody. By the way, it's cool to be in Davis again. Not only did I work at the Pacific Southwest Research Station, like Hugh mentioned, I also got an undergraduate degree here at UC Davis and a master's degree in geography. So I'm a big fan of the town of Davis and UC Davis, and it's great to be here. And so you can see the title of my talk. I'm not going to read it to you, but I'm going to talk about two different projects slash papers. Actually, the second one is not yet a paper. So two projects that are basically big picture fire regime constructions, I guess, or just two big picture issues with fire regimes. So the first project, okay, great. Sorry, trying to move my screen along. There we go. Some of you may have seen this paper that was published just last week in Nature Communications. A fire deficit persists across diverse North American forests despite recent increases in area burned. So I'm going to talk about this project, and I'm going to talk about another project right after I talk about this sucker. So want to just acknowledge all these great co-authors that I worked on with this paper, and it was funded in part by the USGS Powell Center, which paid to get all of us together in a room a couple times in Fort Collins, Colorado. And this author group includes people from the Eastern US, the Southern US, the Western US. We've got Canada, and we've even got Switzerland accounted for in here just for good measure. So, 2020 and 2021 in the Western United States were pretty big fire years, right? They were huge. Major cities were smoked out, right? If you didn't experience it, you saw the pictures of Portland and San Francisco just totally smoked out, and the pictures of the fires that occurred in these years, 2020 and 2021. And so the motivation for this study is that like this, a lot of people, maybe particularly in the media, would say that these fires were quote unquote unprecedented. So the question is, are they actually unprecedented if we take a longer view of fire across North America and in the Western US in particular? And we do see fire increasing, right? Over the last several decades, there have been we all know, right? We've been seeing more fire. So from 1985 to 2017, there's been a six-fold increase in area burned in Western US forests, for example. But if we look farther back in time, we might see something different, right? The plot on the right is a really cool study from Jen Marlin and colleagues, basically looking way back in time, over the last several hundred years, looking at fire and climate and how they varied through time. And I'll interpret this for you, but the black dashed line is basically a metric of climate. Climate's getting warmer and cooler and drier and wetter on average over the last several centuries. and that's kind of above the zero line, showing the warmer and drier. The red line shows fire. So fire is more or less following that black dashed line, right? So um, fire and climate are coupled, right? So as we get warmer and cooler and drier and what have you and wetter, uh, the fire is following that pattern. You know, you see the little ice age in here, for example, where um, the weather is or the climate is cooler, and we see a big drop in fire. And you can see that here on the plot. But you know, about 120 or 140 years ago, these lines split, right? So the black line is no longer following the red line, and vice versa. And so what's happening here is that fire and climate became decoupled, I guess, around the late 1800s. Okay, and this has been termed by Jen Marlin and colleagues the fire deficit. And we see this fire deficit all over the time when we're looking at fire scars in the tree rings, which is shown here on the left, right? This is like a ubiquitous pattern. This isn't just cherry picking one tree to prove a point. There are like thousands and thousands of records that look like this that show very frequent fire up until the late 1800s, and then boom, fire gets turned off. Okay, so that again would be considered the fire deficit. So why do we have a fire deficit, or why did climate and fire become decoupled? There's lots of reasons. One of which is that the indigenous peoples of North America frequently lit fires historically, and um, these people were, you know, removed from the landscape, and their fire practices were ceased in a lot, not in all cases, but in many cases. So we lost an important, you know, the cultural burning. A lot of us have heard about cultural burning and what have you. So that more or less ceased across large parts of the U.S. and then particularly the Western U.S. in the late 1800s. Also in the late 1800s, like industrial level grazing or livestock grazing started, right? And so here's a picture of a bunch of sheep up in the forest. And it's just kind of crazy how actually like the intense grazing removed surface fuels, removed fine fuels that carry fire. And so that also had a role. So even with lightning ignited fires, we're seeing a lot less of those fires spreading because the fuels, the flashy fuels, were removed across large parts of the landscape. And then, of course, we've got the bottom right photo there showing fire suppression, right? We are actively removing fire from the landscape, whether or not they're human ignited or whether or not they're lightning ignited. So that's why fire and climate became decoupled, right? And that's why we have a fire deficit, as Jen Marlin would say. So we decided to take another look at the fire deficit and contemporary fire, especially given that we've been seeing these really big fire years over the last several decades, and in particular, say 2020 and 2021. Does the fire deficit still exist? You know, maybe not, given these recent increases in area burned that I showed earlier. So to test this out, we looked at fire scarred trees and we looked at all the fire scars between 1600 and 1880. And these are basically all records that we could find for the United States and Canada. And we then also compared it to to contemporary fire or fire polygons. So these contemporary fires, at least is defined here in this study, occurred between 1984 and 2022. The fire scar data themselves come from this crazy, I mean, it's very extensive network, North American Tree Ring Fire Scar Network. This was headed up by Ellis Margolis and Chris Guterman a few years back, just getting as much tree ring fire scar data as possible. And the cool thing about these fire scar data, there's two cool things about it. There's like more than two cool things, but I'm going to tell you about two cool things. Three cool things. Okay. There's a lot. There's a lot of yellow dots on that right map. So we have a lot of records. And the second cool thing is we know the location where those records are, right? So we can actually do some intersections with contemporary fire polygons, which is what we do, and I'll get into that momentarily. And we also know how frequently they burn, as you can see in these bottom left photos, not only how frequently they burn, but the exact years that they burned. So for these thousands of sites across the United States and Canada, We know how frequent the fire was and even the exact years they burned. For this particular study, we used a subset of all the North American ones. We used 1,851 fire scar sites in the United States and Canada. Unfortunately, we couldn't include Mexico in this particular study. I'll be also summarizing some of the data by these hexagonal polygons, which were super clever and call them hexels. So just showing you the hexels here, so you can see how they overlay with all the fire scar sites as this presentation continues. So when you look at all the fire scar data, and this is from 1600 to 2021, just to kind of prove a point. So this goes beyond 1880, which is what I showed. We can, as I said, because we know exactly what year they burned, we can start to build, we can start to show the data like this on the left. So for every year, we can look at the percent of sites that were burned. And what you see is that you see a couple things here. Was a lot more fire before 1900 than there is after 1900. You can see there are some years historically where there is just a lot of fire scars burned, meaning there is a lot of fire. So those years like 1748 really pops out. Almost 30% of all the sites in the United States and Canada, at least the 1,851 sites we used in the study, almost 30% of those burned in 1748. That's a lot, right? 1729, over 20% burned, and in 1685, 1822, and 1851, between 15 and 20% of all the sites burned. So we can also display the data that looks a little bit like this, or looks exactly like this, right? We can look at the proportion of years in which different percentages of sites burn. And so that's on the right. And I basically highlighted those same years, right? Just to think about it, another way of looking at the data. So you can see um, different how frequently different percentages of sites burned, right? So there's a lot of zeros here because we're including 1900 to 2021 in this particular plot. If you look at 1600 to 1880, there's like hardly ever zeros, if at all, especially when you're looking at USA and Canada as a whole, there's actually zero zeros. So, so that's the historical data, the fire scar data. And for the contemporary data, we used fire polygons or fire history maps. And for the United States, we used the Monitoring Trends and Burn Severity Program. They also do severity, but we just use the polygons. So we know exactly where the fires burned and exactly what years the fires burned. And in Canada, we used what's called the National Burned Area Composite, or NBAC. And so we basically have these two fire history data sets for the United States and Canada. Again, it covers 1984 to 2022. And so where each of these sites burned, what we did is we intersected them with the fire polygons or the contemporary fire. So even though we're using these sites to look at historical fire between 1600 and 1880, we want to know how frequently would those sites be recording scars if they were still recording scars, basically. So we intersected them with contemporary fire polygons. So in this particular example, we also buffered each site to account, because each site isn't just a point on the landscape, right? Like they go out and they sample a hectare or 10 hectares. It depends on the sampling design for the particular study. This is a big one and just used to prove a point. This is like they sampled a watershed historically. So any fires that occurred historically aren't at just one point. They characterize all the fires in that watershed. So what we did is for each site, each fire history site, we buffered it based on the size that it was sampled originally. And then we intersected it with these fire history polygons. So in this example, even though the centroid of the site actually doesn't hit any polygons because we buffered it and we're assuming that it's a watershed and we want to know how many fires occurred in that watershed. It intersects these two polygons that are orange, shown right here. And so those sites burned. So this site we would have said burned twice from 1984 to 2022, which is a 39-year period. And we calculate this for all 1,851 fire scar sites. So we basically have an idea of how many times these fire scar sites burned under the contemporary time period We also know how many times they burned under the historical time period, because I showed that earlier, and we're looking at it all together. So using the fire scar data from 1600 to 1880, there's a typo here, should say 1880, not 1800. We basically calculated the expected number of times that these sites would have burned under an unrestrained fire regime, meaning like how many times do they burn over like a random 35 year historically. And then we compared that to how many times the observed number of times burned from 1984 to 2022, which is 39 years. So that allowed us to compare the expected number of times burned based on how frequently these sites burned historically. So we compared that to the observed number of times burned based on the fire history polygons. And what you see from a North American perspective, or I mean from Canada and the US, if you take all the sites over a 39-year period, you would expect they would have burned over 4,000 times, 4,346 times. But when you compare it to how many times they actually burned, it was actually the observed number of times burned was quite a lot less. They burned 989 times between 1984 and 2022. So what that means is that these sites burned only about 23% of what we would have expected under an unrestrained fire regime. So basically, this is indicating, yes, there is still a fire deficit, even though we've seen like this rapid increase in area burned over the last several decades. This analysis is also conducted by ecoregion. So we've got a bunch of ecoregions across the United States and Canada. And in all ecoregions, except for the Taiga and Hudson Plain ecoregion in Canada, in all ecoregions, there still is a fire deficit. The far right column is the percent of expected. So again, that's basically the percent of fires that we would have experienced or we would have seen, or I'm saying this wrong. It framed it really nice here. This is what these are about the percent of fires that we would expect under an unrestrained fire regime is in that far right column. So again, in all the ecoregions, except for that northern Canadian ecoregion, there's still a fire deficit. So the Northwest Forested Mountains, that's relevant to, this is a weird ecoregion because it covers Sierra Nevada all the way over to the Southern Rockies, but so it is relevant to California. Basically, only 19% of what we might expect under unrestrained fire regime. Only 19% of the fire scars burned that we might experience under an unrestrained fire regime. In the temperate Sierras, which is this guy down here, the orange guy, which is the Mogollon Rim, only 12% of fires occurred that we might expect under an unrestrained fire regime. So yeah, there's basically a fire deficit across most of these ecoregions. So now I want to get at the idea of like, what about these individual recent years? Are they unprecedented? 2020 and 2021, for example. So the blue here shows that frequency distribution of the proportion of years on the vertical axis and the percent of sites burned on the horizontal axis, and that's the blue. And you can see that, again, as I showed earlier, almost 30% of sites burned in 1748. When we overlay the contemporary fire polygons on those exact same fire scar sites, you can see in this slide, only 6% of the sites burned in the year 2020. So again, the year 2020 was not necessarily unprecedented when we look at this multi-century view of fire. It might be unprecedented since 1984, or maybe even since the 1900s, or since 1900 itself, but it's not unprecedented when we're going back to 1600, okay? What's interesting about this 6%, it's also the historical average. So 2020 matches what happened on an average year historically. So in 2020 was crazy, right? So to think that 2020 was more or less an average year, that's pretty impressive given the impacts that that fire year had to on our society, right? And on our people and on our forests. Here's another view doing like this with a Hexel-based analysis. this is probably a better way to look at it because a lot of those individual fire scar sites are concentrated here in the Southwest. So it's not really, so it's kind of biased towards the Southwest, towards Arizona and New Mexico. So this hexel-based analysis averages all the fire scar data within each hexel and then averages it across North America or across USA and Canada. So basically each hexel has equal weight. And so that gets away from the fact that maybe the fire scar data are biased towards the southwestern US. And you say the same thing more or less, right? That historically, it's shown in blue, there was a lot of fire, up to in 1748, 17% of the mean hexel value burned in 1748. And in 2011 and 2021, that value was 5%. So again, I know I'm like saying the same thing over and over again. These years were not unprecedented when we look at this multi-century, fire record. And in this particular way of looking at the hexels, the historical average was 7%. Yeah. So in this case, if we think this is the better way to look at it, 2011 and 2020 and 2021 were actually less than the historical average. Again, that's, in my mind, pretty incredible. So we've done this analysis, we show it in the paper based on ecoregions as well. So you can check it out. And here's an example of two ecoregions in the Southwest, Arizona and New Mexico. And what's incredible here, 1748, that's that big fire year that seems to keep popping up. Over 70% of all those sites burned in 1748. So there must have been like dozens of very large fires in 1748, like entire mountain ranges burning, right? So the fire sizes must have been quite large as well to have burned 70% or over 70% of all the fire scar sites in 1748. When you can do some math on this, which we've done. And so in the southern semi-arid highlands, which is the orange guy over here, that year 2020 occurred, a year like that occurred about 1 in every 10 years historically, from 1600 to 1880. So it was like a 1 in 10-year thing. So definitely, again, not unprecedented. And the temperate Sierras, which is the purple guy, the Mogollon Rim, and a little bit over there in New Mexico. That year, 2012 was the big year. That's the year the Whitewater Baldy fire burned. If you're familiar with that, that was at the time was the largest fire in New Mexico history. Anyway, that was the biggest fire year in the temperate Sierras, and a fire year like that occurred at 1 out of every 2 years historically. So, just how common fire was historically is just still amazes me almost every day. In the Northwest Forested Mountains ecoregion, 2021 was the biggest fire year based on its intersection with the fire scar record. And a year like that occurred about 1 in every 5 years. And so for each ecoregion, if you go to the paper, you can get this information if you're so interested. I actually intended to try to do this specifically to California and more, but I just couldn't get it all together before I came out here. So I apologize. My bad. So, one big take-home message, or one thing I don't want people to take from this paper is, oh, okay, fire's not unprecedented. It's not a problem, right? There used to be a lot more fire, so the fire we're seeing now may not be a problem. That's not true at all, and I don't want that to be like the take-home message to anyone, right? So fire may not be unprecedented in terms of the number of fire scars that it's intersected with or even area burned in these recent years, but fire is unprecedented in lots of other ways. And I just want to hammer that home a little bit. With the lack of fire, we've seen an incredible change in forest structure and composition. We've just seen every fire that's missed, there's a lost opportunity or missed opportunity to consume fuels that are on the ground and consume smaller diameter fire sensitive trees. Without those fires, we start to get huge accumulations of live and dead fuel. And there's lots of photos out there that show these photo series and just show like, wow, there's a lot more fuels on the landscape with the lack of fire and the associated fire deficit. And the problem is that these areas will inevitably burn, right? We can't perpetually remove fire from our forests because if we could, we wouldn't be having years like 2020. We wouldn't be having years like 2021. Fire will inevitably occur, and when these fires inevitably occur, they're occurring under these conditions where the forests are like really overgrown and have a lot of fuel, and that has some serious impacts, right? Um, what we see is that when that inevitable fire occurs, we're seeing the effects of these fires are uncharacteristic compared to historical norms. So this photo series on the right is actually an area that burned in 2002 in the Hayman Fire in Colorado. So you can see historically in the late 1800s, it was a fairly open forest. After excluding fire for a long time, the forest got a lot denser. There's more trees. There's likely more, pine needles on the ground and dead fuels on the ground that you can't see from this photo. And then it burned in 2002, and there's been a complete wipeout of a lot of the trees. And the footprint within the Hayman Fire is still struggling even after over 20 years in recovery, in terms of recovery back to forest. So basically, in the bottom left here is just kind of a conceptual model from a paper a couple of years ago that showed that these frequent fires kept these dry forests, especially when we're thinking about dry forests and like dry forest, dry mixed conifer forest, a lot of which you have in the Sierra Nevada. These frequent low severity fires perpetuated this state of kind of more open forests and up low severity fires. But when you take fire exclusion in there, the biomass increases and you have an inevitable fire, and you're more likely to see a conversion to non-forest or just in general high severity effects. And we're seeing this more and more. This area is from a wilderness area in New Mexico, historically burned frequent low severity fire. This is the type of forest that would have recorded fire scars, right? There's not a fire, there's no trees recording fire scars now, right? I don't know if there's one live tree in this photo, right? So again, just fire is unprecedented in other ways in its impact on our forests or effects on our forests. Here's 4 photos from wilderness areas. Some of them have very large trees. These very large trees are supposed to be, more fire tolerant and more fire resistant. But because of the excessive fuels on the landscape, these contemporary fires have killed all these trees, and we're seeing this more and more. And as a proportion of area burned, we're seeing basically high severity fires 4 times to 11 times more prevalent in the contemporary period compared to the period prior to 1880 or 1875. Here's a cool study by Emma McClure and colleagues looking at fire scar sites in Arizona and New Mexico. And at these exact fire scar sites, Emma calculated the severity of fires that inevitably occurred. There was like 406 fire scar sites in Arizona and New Mexico. 206 of them burned between 1985 and 2020. And she measured the severity of each of those 206 fires at each of those sites. And basically, over half of all those sites burned at tree killing severity. And so that's totally uncharacteristic of these exact sites. On average, the trees at these sites recorded 6.6 fires each, meaning they lived through several fires. Okay. The sites themselves, each tree experienced on average of 6.6 fires. The sites themselves experienced on average of like 14 or 15 fires between 1895 and 2020. So these sites historically had a lot of fire, a lot of low severity fire, but now these contemporary fires are burning in a manner that's not consistent or uncharacteristic of what they burned historically. Another great photo series, some photos from Wieslander and Alan Taylor, just again showing historic forest structure, larger trees, more spaced out, fire's been excluded, lots of biomass is accumulating, and then the inevitable fire, the 2012 Reading fire occurred, and wiped out all the live trees here. Um, so area burned at high severity is increasing though, right? And so again, getting the idea that fire is unprecedented in other ways. There's been an eightfold increase in area burned at high severity between 1985 and 2017, for example. And I really want to also stress that these fire events that I'm saying are unprecedented in terms of their impacts to forests are also unprecedented on their impacts to humans and communities and human lives, right? There have been some amazing tragedies over the last several years. I mean, we read about them all the time, right? And they're becoming more and more common. And so fire, again, even though we're seeing less fire than we did historically, these fires are really impacting in a negative way our forests and our communities and people in general. Um, and these fires can impact in lots of crazy different ways. You know, the fires that occurred near Rio Doso last year not only directly impacted the community through burning structures and what have you. There's also post-fire, like insane post-fire erosion and post-fire flooding, you know. Again, this area historically experienced frequent low severity fires, and these are like uncharacteristic effects. So we end this paper with this kind of infographic, um, which I'm pretty excited about, that kind of tries to put it all together. I'll walk you through it here. The right the right, or no, the left, sorry, the left vertical axis is kind of showing area burned through time. You can see that, fire was occurring periodically through time. The forests are kind of not very dense. There's less trees. The fire's on the ground. And then starting with the onset about 1880, fire exclusion, fire suppression, average annual area burned tanked. We see our forests getting denser, more denser. Um, and then what we see is over the last couple of decades, these inevitable fires are occurring. We're starting to see, more crown fires and more higher severity effects in these forests than occurred historically. Also, if you look at the right axis, it's about fire feedbacks. And historically, fire would act more as a stabilizing feedback. It's stabilizing forests because you have these frequent fires that are consuming fuel and maintaining certain trees on the landscape and forest structures on the landscape. And basically, fire is now a destabilizing feedback. And I showed photos of that, just destabilizing to our forests in terms of the uncharacteristic severity that these fires are burning at, and it's also destabilizing to our society and our communities. Um, Someone asked me once if historical logging might be what's going on here. It has nothing to do with fuel accumulation. And I just want to touch on that because I don't think there's a lot of evidence that there's way more evidence that fuel accumulation due to fire exclusion is more to blame for these uncharacteristic fires we're seeing compared to, say, industrial forest activities that occurred in, say, the mid 1900s. And there's lots of lines of evidence, but I'm just going to show you this particular line of evidence, this paper I published a couple of years ago. Um, Contemporary wildfires are more severe compared to the historical reference period in Western US dry forests. One of the sub-analyses we did in this paper was compare severity inside of wilderness and outside of wilderness and looked at it. As inside of wilderness, there's been very little logging, right? And so in theory, if logging was to blame, if historical logging was to blame for our contemporary fire severity, you'd expect to see wilderness areas having much lower severity than outside of wilderness areas. And fire severity was slightly lower in wilderness than outside of wilderness, but not a lot, right? And actually that in some places, like in the Gila wilderness, the fire severity is a lot lower in the Gila wilderness, but it's not because it hasn't been logged, it's because there's a restored fire regime in the Gila wilderness, right? So the inference here is basically that fuel accumulation from fire exclusion has played a much larger role than any sort of historical logging in the prevalence of contemporary stand replacing fire. Okay, I'm going to go on to project number 2 that is yet to be published, but hopefully submitted soon. I'm working on this with Kim Davis and Jonathan Coop, and tentatively titled Climate Warming is Accelerating Severe Wildfire in Western US Forests. And the idea here is to update this previous paper that John Abatoglu and I did, and to dig a little deeper and to make some inferences or projections under a future climate. This paper titled Warmer and Drier Fire Seasons Contribute to Increases in Area Burned at High Severity Fire, whatever, you can read it. But what this paper showed is that between 1985 and 2017, there's been a six-fold increase in area burned and an eightfold increase in area burned severely. And what do I mean by area burned severely? Let me just talk about what that means. But basically, there's different fire effects out there. Fires don't all burn in the same way. You have low severity fire, you have moderate severity fire, you have high severity fire. Low severity fire would be oftentimes what prescribed fire is attempting to mimic, right? So low severity fire would be oftentimes considered a good thing, right? Or restorative for our forests. Whereas high severity fire, particularly in forests that didn't historically experience high severity fire, is, maybe not the best for that forest type. So when I'm talking about high severity fire, I'm talking about this far right over here, where basically all or most trees die. So like think about like 90 to 95%, 90 or 95% or more canopy mortality die. That's what I'm going to call high severity fire or standard placing fire. And I'm not going to get into the methods too much, but I do want to just say that, yeah, we measured fire severity using satellite imagery in Google Earth Engine, and we measured fire severity for all fires that occurred between 1985 and 2022 in Western US forests. So thousands of fires. So the objectives for this particular study were to quantify trends in area burned severely from 1985 to 2022 in Western US forests. The Western US forests are shown in the non-gray on the right. The colors refer to different forest types with different FRGs, which stands for fire regime groups. Just to quickly tell you what that means, a fire regime group 1 is the warmer, drier forests that historically experience frequent lower severity fire. It's also the most common forest type in the Western US, and it has burned the most over this time period. And not only has it burned the most, it's burned the most proportionally over this time period. Fire regime group 5 is like very infrequent, but standard placing fire, really high severity fire historically. And so fire regime groups 3 and 4 are kind of in between those two bookends. The second objective here is to investigate these various relationships, some relationships between proportion burn severely and annual area burn and fire size. And then the third objective is to make projections of area burned and area burned severely for the mid 21st century based on observed fire climate relationships. So again, these results are more or less just updating this previous paper with John Abatoglu and I. And so area burned has increased tenfold since 1985, and area burned severely has increased 15-fold since 1985. So fire is continuing to it's nonlinear increase too, by the way, if you look at this, right? So we're seeing acceleration in area burned and area burned severely. We also do show this for every fire regime group, if you're so interested. So again, fire regime group 1 is the top left. It's the most common forest type in the Western US. Again, historically experienced frequent and low severity fire. So you can see that in all cases, there's been at least a 10-fold increase in area burned and at least a 14-fold increase in area burned severely in each of these fire regime groups. And these are just some cool relationships. And so we're still trying to craft an interesting story about this, but on the left shows proportion burned severely on an annual basis, and it really scales to area burned, annual area burned. So the more area burned you have in a given year, the more of that fire burned severely is a proportion of area burned. So in 2020, for example, that's the very far right orange dot, that had the most area burned and the most area burned severely, or the most proportion burned severely. So if we expect to see more area burned in future decades and future years, we might expect to see more proportion burned severely, which doesn't necessarily bode well for our forests, right? The middle plot shows how median fire size has, as median fire size increases, proportion burned severely increases. So it's just another way to think about this. So basically, um, the proportion burned severely as fire size increases scales not only from like fire size, but also scales to annual area burned. Basically, bigger fires, more area burned, you have higher proportion burned severely. And then we're also just showing on the far right that, yeah, fire size is increasing through time for sure. So here's the observed relationships between area burned and basically fire season climate or fire season aridity. Fire season aridity, it's a metric that Park Williams and or John Abotslu introduced a few years ago. It's basically the average of several fire season climate metrics. In this case, it's fire season VPD, average with fire season maximum temperature, average with fire season climatic water deficit. So what we see here is that the drier we get, the more area burned we get, and the drier the fire season, the more area burned severely we get. And what's it's interesting yet somewhat terrifying is this nonlinear relationship, right? So a little bit more to the right, a little bit more drier fire seasons, we get a lot more area burned and area burned severely. And that's um, somewhat terrifying, I think. So the projections show, I'll walk you through this, but the very left in blue shows area burned and area burned severely under, the 1985 to 2022 climate. And the I don't even know what color this is, kind of pinkish. That shows the modeled 21st century, mid 21st century projections of area burned severely. And so the take-home message, there's a couple of take-home messages here. One is that basically by mid-century, we were expecting a 2.9-fold increase in mean annual burned, and a fourfold increase in high severity area burned. So that's a lot more fire and a lot more severe fire. The other take-home message is looking at 2020 and 2021, big fire years that really impacted our forests and our communities and even our big cities. These fire years, they were big, but when we look at the future, the triangle there and the pinkish stuff shows the mean value in the future. It might be the median value, I'm not actually sure. But basically what it shows is that 2020 and 2021, is potentially quote unquote the new normal, which is again, kind of concerning given like the impacts of those fires, of the impacts that those fires had. So everything is forest based. It's area burned in forest and area burned severely in forest. So some people might be, well, forest is going to disappear at these rates, so how could you have a fourfold increase in area burned severely in forests if forests are decreasing? So we also have a sub-analysis here that are looking at percent forest burned. And same thing, I'm not going to show you the fire climate relationships on percent forest burned, but the same thing happens is that this is actually wrong. It's basically about sorry, this is a typo. It should be about a 2.5-fold increase for area burn or percent burned severely, percent forest burned, and percent forest burned severely. I made a last minute edit to this presentation and messed that up. Oh well. Point being, sorry about that. Point being is that again, the future, the black triangles and the pinkish boxes are about equal what we saw in 2020 and 21. So even if we see maybe some self-regulation of the past fires, we're still seeing a lot of fire as a percent of forests burned under mid 21st century conditions. So I just want to kind of wrap up here and just kind of like talk about this. My first half of the presentation or part of the presentation said, hey, there's like this fire deficit. But the second half, it's like, whoa, but fire is increasing. Like how can you have a fire deficit and fire increasing? What gives? Again, I'll just kind of point out that this on the right, that's just a snapshot in time, right? And if you can actually figure out where that is based on the infographic or conceptual model here, right? 85 to 2020 to 2022 is a snapshot in time. Fire is increasing even though we're seeing less fire than we did historically. And Mark Kreider published this cool paper last year looking at fire suppression and what he called the fire suppression bias. And basically he just one of the cool quotes in that paper is in our attempt to eliminate all fires, we've only eliminated the less intense fires and instead selected primarily for the most extreme events and created higher fuel loads and more suppression resistant fires. So what we're seeing now is a lot of suppression resistant fires, and the under increased warming and drying of our climate, we're going to even have more time um, suppressing these fires. So we'll see more suppression resistant fires. So this may be my last slide, but no, maybe it's not. But so again, I just want to show this idea that the models show a fourfold increase in area burned severely under mid 21st century conditions. And that, again, I've used the word terrifying several times, and that's terrifying. But I think it's important to go back to the historical context, right? And so we saw in 1748, over 70% of the sites in the southwestern US burned. But those fires didn't kill the trees, right? They burned in a manner that damaged the trees. They recorded a fire scar. The tree kept living, right? So there is some sort of hope, right? Like I guess there's a historical context for having huge area burned, but not all that fire being super high severity fire that's killing the trees, not being a tree killing severity, right? So I basically consider this, just one of multiple alternative futures, right? Maybe a business as usual future. Um, but we have the ability to change our forests and try to set them up maybe to more conditions that were prevalent in 1748, where the fires can burn. We're still going to see more fires no matter what in the future. But we could change the way those fires burn. We could change the severity of the way those fires burn. And so, you know, proactive fire management, right? Thinning and prescribed fire is basically shown to be this great new paper by Kim Davis and colleagues, a review paper of field treatments. Forest thinning, prescribed fire are extremely effective at reducing the severity of the inevitable wildfire. So maybe we won't see a fourfold increase in area burn severely under future conditions if we try to take a different alternative future. So with that, I will end. And sorry for the technical difficulties when we got started.
Wasn't your fault. Great. So we've got 15 minutes for questions. I also have a couple of questions online, but let's start with in the room. Yeah, John.
So the fires, the past fires, 1700s, do you think that relationship that you show with bigger fires, more severity did not exist back then? And I guess kind of a companion question was, it seems like it's implied that there were also big fires back then, but that's pretty hard to really verify with the tree ring data, right? As far as like, do we have a sense of, were there 300,000 acre fires back then, or is that just kind of the math kind of make it add up?
Yeah, okay. So part one, yeah, historically, there were certainly high severity fires, especially in the cooler and wetter, fire types. Fire regime groups 4 and 5 had less frequent but more severe fire. That's like the natural historical fire regime. So yeah. In these drier forest types, there were some high severity fires, but they're considered to have occurred way, way less frequently. And if there were a lot of high severity fires in these drier forest types, we wouldn't have any fire scarred trees, right? So, and there are fire scarred trees everywhere. I go hiking in the forest with my kids, my daughters, and I'm like, there's one, they're sick of it. And I'm like, bonus points if you show me a fire scarred tree, and they're everywhere, even in Montana, I mean, they're everywhere. Your second question was what again?
The size of the fires, and so
Oh, yeah.
were you like, do
Okay.
we know really that those were not, I mean,
Okay.
mean fire size was smaller back then, but
I don't,
maybe.
I, a lot of people will say fire sizes were smaller back then, and I will disagree with that. I don't have any direct evidence, but when you see 70% of all the fire scars burning in 1 year, it's not 300,000 1 hectare fires, right? Or a million 1 hectare fire. It's like there's probably some small fires, but it's got to be several large fires, that are burning entire mountain ranges. And I do know there are some people looking at reconstructing like area burns in specific mountain ranges in the Southwest. And what I've been shared preliminarily is there's some very big fires that burn in a year. I guess you don't know if it's 20 fires burning the same mountain range in a year, but it's probably one fire, a bunch of small fires that come together and form a complex like we see now. We see a bunch of fires coming together and form a complex. So it's just hard for me to believe, given how frequently, how when you see just all those fire scars burning in 1 year, I just don't buy that it's a bunch of small fires.
So in that sense, that first question, probably question, you could have a mega fire and basically that relationship doesn't exist with the.
Right. You can have a quote unquote mega fire, but that fire doesn't necessarily have those detrimental negative impacts to forests and communities, right? Like think about a 1 million acre prescribed fire. Wouldn't that be nice?
So, yeah, so I wanted to bring up something that you can opine on, and I think we probably all agree. But we've been saying and hearing from others for decades that the answer to all of this is pretty massive increases in the amount of active forest management.
Yep.
But we also know that from a variety of sources that, for example, that from the forest thinning side, number one, there really aren't any sawmills left in a whole lot of the US outside of the Pacific Northwest and maybe 10. And second, that most of the Forest Service land base is not treatable by mechanical treatment because it's in wilderness areas, it's in inventory roadless areas, it's too far from roads, it's too steep.
Yep.
And prescribed fire is, the landscape isn't covered by Native Americans setting constant fire to the landscape as a management tool. And really hard to see prescribed fire ever being anything more than a drop in the bucket, to be candid. So that leaves you wildfire as the treatment of choice. So anyway, where I'm going with this. I'd be interested to just hear your opinion on that and how viable is that? Because that is the only thing that's going to treat most of our landscape is actually wildfire. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about sort of the fire management, the forest management, and building that.
Yeah, there's more area treated by wildfire, quote unquote, treated by wildfire than, all these traditional fuel treatments combined, right? On an average annual basis, right? And a lot of folks have said that we, should definitely be considering wildfire as one of our tools, right? And I I largely agree with that, and it's unfortunate, it's tough, right? There's a couple things that make it tough. A lot of our forests aren't now set up well for fire, right? And so to have some sort of wildfire being an effective treatment, we'd want, you kind of have to make sure you let the fires go during the cooler and wetter years in positions of the landscape that are safer and farther from communities, right? We're not at a point where we can just let all fires go and think everything is going to be hunky dory, because most of those fires are going to occur under these extreme fire seasons still and have these extreme, negative effects that we're seeing of our the current contemporary fires that we're seeing. Yeah. So I think managed wildfire plays a role, but we have to be careful about when we, apply it, making sure it's in these cooler and wetter conditions. So, they don't kill all the trees, right? And, um, I mean, we're in a pickle, right? I don't have an answer. We're in a pickle. You're right. Prescribed fire thinning treatments is always going to be, maybe it'll always be in a drop in the bucket, but, you know, a society put a lot of effort one time in trying to get people to the moon, right? Maybe a lot of money. Like if perhaps if it was a huge priority, we could do a little bit more than a drop in the bucket, even with those traditional treatments of thinning and prescribed fire.
Remember, though, that this is the same society that's busy convincing itself that we never actually made it to the moon. Anyway, let's say any other questions in the room? Yeah, well, over here.
1748. Yeah, this one. Was it across all of them? Certainly.
Can you repeat the question, by the way, just to make sure?
Yeah, okay. There's a question specifically about 1748. Why was it big? Was it a big fire year globally? Was the question, if I got it right. So from what I gather, we've looked at this a little bit. 1748 was not exceptional. It was not like the biggest drought year or anything like that. I mean, it was dry, but it wasn't like the driest, right? Even though it had the most area burn. Probably what happened is there was, because a lot of those records were from the Southwest, and there could have been a wet year the year before, which like created a lot of fuel and then allowed it to burn in 1748. We haven't taken a deep dive in 1748, you know. Whether that's global or not, that would be tough to know because the fire scar records are only relevant to certain forest types and tree species. Someone from Australia contacted me and said, "Oh, I wish we had this for Australia, but the eucalyptus trees don't, they don't scar, they die, or something like that." So you can't get that annual resolution in lots of other places, right? So I don't know if 1748 was big globally or not.
I wonder too, when I think about that is, yeah, maybe it's not a big dry year, but also southwestern US, you got not only a monsoonal kind of thing going on, but periodically you'll get crazy tropical storms that'll end up on land. That's what drove the 2020 fires, and that's what drove the 87 fires, in northwestern California and southwestern Oregon. So you could have had one of those stranded tropical storms that just ends up hitting, and just dropping a billion lightning, strikes, over a period. Anyway, so okay, I've got a couple questions here online. So this one, tree rings tend to record fire scars mostly for moderate severity fire because low severity leaves no scar and high severity kills trees. By how much do you think these methods might underestimate historical fire frequency?
Yeah, so that's a good one, and my guess is that so we're showing this fire deficit. My guess is that well, first of all, it's only relevant to where we have fire scar data, and that's done intentionally. We specifically overlapped the fire perimeters with where the fire scar data were collected. So we're not going to make inferences from where the fire scar data aren't. So we're not making inferences to forest types even where the fire scar data are not. Okay, so that was like very intentional because people will often criticize fire scar studies because you're saying, oh, well, you're making inferences in forest types where the fire scar data don't exist. And we're saying, no, this fire deficit is exactly where these fire scar data were collected, right? As for missing low severity fire historically, I'm sure we're missing some historically, and that would actually mean the fire deficit is bigger, right? So I'd rather, as a scientist, I'd rather be like underestimating the fire depth or kind of, underestimating it than saying that there's a bigger fire depth, or there's a smaller fire deficit, like we're doing what we can. And the fire deficit might even be bigger. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right.
Similar
Please,
to
yeah,
this.
go.
Yeah, so one of the first slides you showed that there was a strong relation between climate variability and fire variability. And in the last years, this like decoupled, century, this decoupled. And in your first project, you show frequencies, but these frequencies are not related to like weather, like fire weather. No? So if the last 40 years we've seen an increase on temperature or aridity, you would expect even also higher frequency. So at the same time, this percentage deficit you're showing could be even like more fire deficit if we would take into account weather conditions.
Yeah. So what Andrea was saying is that the climate we've had over the last several decades is warmer than we've seen historically, and so the if fire was following climate exactly, the fire deficit might actually be bigger than what we're showing in this study. And yeah, that's definitely a point.
Okay, I mean, it's because your study is mostly frequency, like if you have this amount of years, you were expecting this amount of fires.
Right, that analysis doesn't take climate into effect at all, right? It's just saying how much fire occurred on average or in its specific years, historically. And so, so you're right. We've had these warmer conditions, and if we had a quote unquote unrestrained fire regime, we might actually see more fire than we saw historically. So that would mean the fire deficit that we're documenting here is actually potentially bigger. Yes.
This is an interesting one. I don't know if you're gonna be able to get much traction on this question, but I want to answer it. Ask it. Do we have any sense of the extent to which mass extinction of salmonids contributes to wildfire severity, considering, the whole marine derived nutrient thing that they used to deliver, right, in the western forest, theoretically affecting greater soil health and forest resilience?
Yeah, I'm not qualified to answer that question for sure. I'm sorry about that. But the question, if no one heard, was about basically the lack of salmon runs and the nutrients they introduce to forests. And we have less salmon runs now, and so does that lack of recent nutrient inputs have any sort of effect on forest structure and the contemporary fire severity we're seeing? And I don't know the answer to that. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a great one. It's interesting because I was involved in thinking about a study like that, understanding how because the salmon are just a massive nitrogen input. And they're gone at most of these, so that's a huge change. Could prove to be the answer to everything. You never know. Any other questions in the room? We had some other comments and stuff that came up, but I don't know that they're really viable for asking a little bit about WUI and then, how do we get people and how do we get them to be better stewards? Well, not sure that's something we can talk about here. One thing is a couple of comments here from someone about, remember you and I were chatting earlier today about Jeffrey pine? I was telling you about some interesting Jeffrey pine stuff and how it is so drought tolerant. And someone noting that, why we could be using Jeffrey pine forests from Baja California as, they're not saying reference systems, but that's what I'm getting from it. And I'll just say that it's interesting because when we built the forest management plan for the Lake Tahoe Basin, we used reference data from Scott Stevens' papers from the Baja forest because we wanted to base, he had that great stuff on a great reference for us. So it's an interesting idea. Someone else is thinking about Jeffrey pine. All right, John, you have
just one quick question. Just that here you have a distribution of the tree ring data, and you had that nice line going into the Sierra Madre in Mexico. Has anything been done with that? And that's really intriguing. And how are those trees same age? They have that same potential to go back to 17?
Yeah, so we didn't include Mexico in the study, even though we have the tree ring fire scar data. It's there, it's ready to go. But what we don't have for Mexico is very good contemporary fire polygons.
Yeah.
So to make that, so we could look at fire historically in Mexico, but it would be very difficult to look at how contemporary fire compares to that. But we've thought a lot about it. We've talked a lot about it in our group. It's an extra challenge and something would be great to do.
Yeah, it's intriguing. Yeah.
Yep.
And that's one of those data sets that's just a key one for almost any work that you want to do in fires. You really need to know fire history, and you need to kind of have the 40-ish years at least, and it's amazing most of the world doesn't have that.
Yeah, we're lucky in the United States and Canada to have such great fire history data sets for sure. Those don't exist elsewhere, and whenever I get a chance, I thank the MTBS program. I'll thank them right now, the Monitoring Trends and Burn Severity program, for making these data available, and also the Canadian NBAC. That's awesome too.
Well, okay, Troy.
Well, it's a boring methodological question. I was gonna wait to see if there was time, but why hexels?
Okay, the question is why use hexels as opposed to
Or then just treating each point independently, or treating each point based off of like some historical climactic zone. Like, I'm just curious about
Yeah, the hexels, I mean, you can't use circles because they would overlap. Squares we could have used, but hexels are they're more, it's the closest thing to a circle as you can get without being a circle, I guess. And they nest well with each other. But the point-based analysis is what I showed before that, right? And so the sampling is biased towards where there's a lot of fire scars. And so doing the hexels gets away from that. Maybe you're asking about like vegetation type or something like that. Do it by that. And that's one reason why we did ecoregions, right? So that it's a very broad vegetation type kind of, but it's hard to do vegetation types because, especially if you're doing Canada and the US, because the maps don't line up, right? And so we've thought about this for sure. It came up in the review for sure, like why don't you do veg types? And I've tried to make United States and Canada vegetation maps play well together, and it's hard, right? So Hexel's just made it easy, and then I think the ecoregions partially gets at what you're talking about, but not entirely.
Cool. Okay, one more question. You got it. Last one.
You're mentioning ecoregions reminded me. I was wondering when you talked about expected fire like percentage by ecoregion, all of them were way below expected, except for the taiga and Hudson Plain.
Yeah.
What's different there?
So the question was, why was the taiga and Hudson Plain a lot different than the other ecoregions? So there would be potentially a fire surplus there. We don't go too much into that because, there's not that many sites in that ecoregion, and they're very clustered, and they all just happen to burn this one really big fire year. So it's just one of those things where I don't want to, it did show a fire, quote unquote fire surplus, but I think pontificating about it too much might just not be appropriate given like the spatial distribution of the fire scar sites in that particular ecoregion. And then 2023, it burned a lot, right? But it didn't burn where we have fire scar records. So that's the other thing is that fire scar records in this study that I showed is relevant to where there are fire scar records, not really relevant to where there are not fire scar records. And that's like an important caveat, right?
Okay, well, thanks you very much. And don't get off yet. I just want to say to the folks also on the web, thank you for being on. There are 2 more funeral lectures coming up in April. And if you are on your on the webinar link, but you're in Davis, we're going to be at Bull and Mouth at 6 o'clock for drinks and dinner, and you're all invited as well. I'm not paying for all of you, but you can certainly go. I also wanted to thank the California Fire Science Consortium for sponsoring and also organizing the web link for this. You guys, the consortium for which I'm one of the regional directors is pretty extraordinary organization and is under some pretty serious duress, as a lot of federal organizations are currently. So anyway, thanks for being on. All right.